All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. You give us the sources, and we get to work pulling out the most interesting and useful bits for you. Today, we're diving into the world of Freemasonry with excerpts from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry.
Ah, yes. Freemasonry, definitely a topic that tends to attract, well, a lot of speculation. So having this kind of comprehensive resource, an encyclopedia, is a pretty fantastic way to cut through all that and get right to the core of what it's really about.
Couldn't agree more. And for our listeners, those who, like us, want to understand things quickly and thoroughly, this is going to be a really rewarding deep dive. No sorting through mountains of sometimes dubious information. Our mission today, to understand the history, the principles, the cultural impact of Freemasonry, all while separating fact from fiction.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's just jump right in, shall we? First things first, what exactly is Freemasonry according to this encyclopedia?
Okay, so right off the bat, the encyclopedia makes a really important distinction between what's called operative masonry and speculative masonry.
Okay, yeah.
Operative masonry, that's the hands-on stuff, the actual stonemasons building physical structures.
Right. The actual craft.
Exactly. But the Freemasonry we're talking about today, the one that exists now, that's speculative masonry, it takes those same principles, the tools, the symbolism, and applies them to, personal and moral growth.
So it's less about bricks and mortar and more about what? Building character.
You got it. Building yourself, in a way. Now, this encyclopedia, it estimates that there are roughly 6 million Freemasons around the world. And it's not like one massive organization. It operates under independent Grand Lodges, Grand Orients.
Okay, so kind of like different national or regional chapters.
That's a good way to think about it, each with their own specific rules and traditions, but all connected by this, this shared foundation of Masonic principles. And we're talking about a history that spans centuries. Freemasonry has been around for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia really highlights its role in various communities throughout history.
Through charity work.
Charity work, absolutely. Community involvement, leadership, you name it. It's definitely not a fleeting fad or anything.
Right, right. A long history deeply rooted in many societies. Well, now I'm really curious about those origins. I mean, everyone's heard whispers about, secret societies and ancient traditions. What does the encyclopedia say about where Freemasonry actually began?
Well, funnily enough, the encyclopedia is pretty upfront about the fact that the exact origins are, well, still kind of murky.
Oh, really? So some of the mystery is actually real.
In a way, yes. There are lots of legends, of course, passed down through the years, but historically speaking, most scholars trace the roots back to the stonemasons guilds of Europe, specifically like the medieval period, think 14th to 17th century.
The guys who built those incredible cathedrals and castles, right?
Those are the ones, these operative masons, they form these guilds, these lodges to, well, to kind of regulate their trade. Think of it like a combination of a union, a training program, and like a professional association all rolled into one.
So like any other skilled trade, they wanted to maintain standards and make sure people knew who the real deal was.
Exactly. And to do that, they developed their own system of, well, secrets, special words, handshakes, signs, things that only a properly trained mason would know.
Like a secret code for stonemasons?
You could say that.
Yeah.
It allowed them to, travel to different cities, find work, and prove they were legitimate. The encyclopedia even points to early Masonic documents, these old charges, they're called. Things like the Regis poem from like the 1390s and the Cook manuscript from around 1410. They lay out some of those early rules, stories about their origins, that kind of thing.
Wow, so we're really going back in time here. But how did we go from those practical guilds to the more philosophical, symbolic Freemasonry we see today? How did that transition happen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, as those huge cathedral projects started winding down in the later Middle Ages, some of those operative lodges, they started doing something interesting. They began admitting non-stonemasons as honorary members. It was this mix of like wealthy patrons, scholars, influential figures who were drawn to the social aspect of the lodges, the sense of tradition, and maybe even the moral philosophy that was starting to kind of emerge within those groups.
So it began almost like a social club, a way to network.
There was definitely that element to it, yes. The encyclopedia talks about Elias Ashmole, this English scholar. He was initiated in 1646, and that's seen as an early documented case. And over in Scotland, the Lodge of Edinburgh, they were admitting non-working members even earlier in the 1600s. So you start to see this blending of the practical stonemason side and these more speculative philosophical interests.
And that's how it shifted from, actually building things to building something within yourself.
Precisely. Now, fast forward to the 18th century. Freemasonry, it's really starting to take shape, and there's this growing interest in, well, in making those origins seem even more ancient and prestigious.
Oh, I see. Connect it to something grander, more mysterious.
Exactly. And so you have all these myths and legends popping up, links to King Solomon's temple, ancient Egypt, the Knights Templar.
Now that's what people really imagine when they think about Freemasonry. Those really capture the imagination.
They do, and they became part of the lore.
Right.
Anderson's Constitutions from 1723. That's a key document, and it really leans into those connections to Solomon's Temple. And later, you get those high-degree systems like the Scottish Rite and the York Rite. They incorporate Templar themes, chivalric traditions. It all adds to this sense of an ancient and noble lineage.
But of course, the encyclopedia makes it clear that historians today have a more grounded view of those
Oh,
origins.
absolutely. They're not denying the importance of those traditions within Freemasonry, but they're very careful to separate historical fact from the mythical embellishments. The general consensus is that, Freemasonry as we know it, it really solidified in Britain in the 1600s and 1700s. It evolved out of those medieval guilds, keeping the symbols and structures, but adapting them to this new speculative purpose.
Okay, so the ancient links are more symbolic than directly historical.
That's it. It's that shift from operative to speculative, that formal organization under grand lodges, and this fascinating mix of those old stonemason symbols with the big ideas of the Enlightenment that really defined its path.
Okay, so we've got a better sense of where it came from. But what about the heart of it all? What does Freemasonry actually teach? What's its core philosophy?
Well, the encyclopedia describes Freemasonry as, at its core, a system of moral philosophy. It's not a religion, it doesn't dictate specific doctrines, but it uses allegories, symbols, ritual dramas, all to teach lessons about virtue, duty, and the nature of a good life.
So it's more about ethical guidance, like a framework for how to live.
Exactly. And the way they teach those lessons, it's often through those building tools, right? Each tool has a symbolic meaning, a lesson attached to it, and the whole thing is very much rooted in Enlightenment humanism.
So reason, knowledge, the value of the individual, those kinds of things.
Those are big ones, yeah. But it also draws on older traditions, like the ideas of civic responsibility, of chivalrous conduct. There's this emphasis on honesty, compassion, temperance, a real commitment to striving for high ideals.
And the lodge setting itself, that must play a part in all this, right?
Oh, without a doubt. It's this unique environment where men from all walks of life, they meet as equals.
Literally on the level.
Literally on the level. It breaks down those social barriers and creates a space for genuine friendship and understanding. And that's a big part of it.
The encyclopedia also mentions relief as a central principle. What's that all about?
Relief in Freemasonry, it means active compassion. It's not enough to just feel sympathy. You have to actually do something to alleviate suffering. And it's not just encouraged, it's considered a duty.
A duty, wow. So they take charity very seriously.
Very seriously. It starts with helping fellow Masons, their families, but it goes beyond that, out into the wider community. The encyclopedia actually points to like the historical role of Masonic charities. They were involved in founding hospitals, schools, relief funds, all sorts of things.
So that whole motto, Freemasonry makes good men better, it's really tied to that idea of service.
Absolutely. It's about the belief that actively helping others, that's a key part of becoming a better person yourself.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, now let's talk about some of those persistent misconceptions.
Oh yes, those.
The ones that seem to always follow Freemasonry around. The encyclopedia tackles a few of them head on. First up, the idea that women cannot be Freemasons.
That's a big one. And the encyclopedia does a really good job of explaining the nuances here.
Right, because it's not quite as simple as it seems.
Exactly. Historically, yeah, regular Freemasonry, the mainstream kind, it has been exclusive to men. And that comes from, those old medieval guild traditions and the social norms of the time. But that doesn't tell the whole story.
Because there are Masonic organizations that do include women. It's just that they're separate.
That's right. There have been women-only Grand Lodges since the late 1800s. And there are mixed gender orders as well. And they practice similar rituals, have similar structures, but
But they're not officially recognized by those mainstream male lodges.
that's the key point.
Mm-hmm.
They're often considered irregular by the big guys. But, and this is interesting, the United Grand Lodge of England one of the most influential Masonic bodies, they actually acknowledged in 2018 that these women's lodges, they pretty much followed the same principles.
Except for their admission of women,
That's
right?
the phrase they used, yeah.
So it's this interesting situation where, it's not a blanket no women allowed, but there's this kind of division based on how those organizations evolved historically.
That's it, in a nutshell. And the encyclopedia also mentions things like the Order of the Eastern Star. That's a big one. And it involves both women and men who have Masonic connections. So it shows that there's actually more diversity within the Masonic world than people might realize.
Makes sense. Okay, another misconception the encyclopedia tackles head on. Freemasonry involves sinister plots or political control. This is where we get into the whole Illuminati
Oh,
stuff.
yes, that whole conspiracy theory realm.
And the encyclopedia doesn't shy away from that.
Not at all. It states very clearly that Freemasonry, as an institution, it has no central authority to, like, orchestrate global agendas or anything like that. And individual Masons, they owe their allegiance to their own countries, not to some, shadowy Masonic cabal.
So that image of pulling the strings behind the scenes, secretly controlling world events, that's not what's happening.
The encyclopedia makes it pretty clear that there's no evidence for that. And it even points to the fact that membership has been declining in many places.
Right, which wouldn't really make sense if they were, this all-powerful secret society.
Exactly. Now, the encyclopedia does acknowledge that the historical emphasis on secrecy within Freemasonry, along with some of those symbols, like the Eye of Providence.
Which is, of course, on the dollar bill, so people immediately make those connections.
Right, that can feed into conspiracy theories, for sure. But the book makes it clear that those symbols, they have their own specific meanings within Freemasonry, and they're not, evidence of some shadowy plot to control the world.
It's interesting how symbols can be interpreted in such different ways.
It is. The encyclopedia also talks about other common misconceptions, like connections to the occult, or the idea that Masons always favor each other in business or politics. And it points to how Freemasonry has become more transparent in recent years, trying to, dispel those myths by being more open about their practices.
Trying to show people what's really going on behind those closed doors.
That's the idea.
Okay, so it's not about world domination. It's about personal growth, charity, brotherhood,
Hmm.
and maybe a bit of, well, healthy mystery.
That sums it up pretty well.
Now let's go back to those ancient roots we were talking about earlier. The connections to ancient Egypt, Solomon's Temple, the Knights Templar.
Ah, yes, the stuff of legends.
We know those connections aren't historically proven, but the encyclopedia says they still hold a very important place within Masonic tradition and symbolism. Why is that?
Well, I think it's about adding a layer of, depth and meaning to the teachings. It connects Freemasonry to this long lineage of wisdom and knowledge. The encyclopedia points out that even in some of those very early Masonic texts, you see those mythical connections. The Regis poem, for example, it ties the origins of geometry and therefore masonry to ancient Egypt. And then, of course, there's that transmission to the builders of Solomon's Temple.
And Solomon's Temple itself, that's a huge symbol within Freemasonry, right?
It's central to their rituals and their understanding of themselves. They see it as a model of perfection, this allegory for building your own character.
And then there's the whole Knights Templar connection. That's a popular one, too.
Oh, yeah, very popular. The Encyclopedia actually talks about how after the Templars were suppressed, back in the 1300s, this idea emerged that some of them survived and secretly continued their order,
Yeah.
eventually influencing or even merging with the early Freemasons.
So that's where we get those chivalric themes and imagery in some of those higher Masonic degrees.
Exactly. It adds this romantic, almost heroic element to the story. And those legends, they really took off in the 18th century with guys like Baron de Leibniz and Chevalier Ramsay writing about these supposed Templar origins. And you see those themes woven into things like the Scottish Rite, which has those knightly degrees, and the York Rite, which has its own order of Knights Templar.
Okay, so not a direct historical link, but more like a way to enrich the symbolism and connect to those ideas of chivalry and ancient wisdom.
Exactly. While historically, Freemasonry most likely emerged from those late medieval guilds, the cultural identity, it embraced those ancient myths and legends, and they really became part of its symbolic language.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we talked about that shift from operative to speculative masonry. Can we Can we delve a little deeper into that transition? What happened there?
Sure. The encyclopedia makes it pretty clear what operative masonry was. It was this actual work, the craft of stonemasons using their tools to build things.
And they needed those secret signs and words for practical reasons.
That was their way of, proving they were legitimate, that they knew the trade, that they were, one of the skilled guys.
Makes sense. But how did those non-operatives, those accepted Masons, really start to enter the picture?
Well, the encyclopedia points to, like, the early 1600s as a key period. The Lodge of Edinburgh, for example, they initiated Lord Alexander in 1600 and then Sir Robert Moray in 1641. Neither of those guys were stonemasons. So it seems those craft guilds were already starting to evolve into something more social, more, well, speculative, especially in Scotland.
And we see similar things happening in England.
Yes. Elias Ashmole, we talked about him before. He was initiated in 1646. And this is interesting because it suggests that even as the actual stonemason trade might have been declining in some areas, the idea of being a Freemason, part of this fraternity, it was becoming more and more popular. And that term, free and accepted Mason, it meant you were, accepted into the lodge without actually being a stonemason.
So you enjoyed the freedoms of the guild, so to speak, even without the actual trade skills.
That's it. And over time, those lodges, they just started accepting more and more of these non-Mason patrons, these gentlemen who were interested in the social aspects, the fellowship.
And maybe the moral principles that were starting to be emphasized.
Exactly. So it gradually became less about the craft itself and more about these broader ideas. And that transition period was really crucial. That's when we start to see the lodge system, the degrees of initiation, the emphasis on secrecy, the whole development of that legendary history we talked about.
So by like 1700, the landscape was really changing.
Big time. Many lodges, particularly in England and Scotland, they were becoming more like social and moral clubs. And that really set the stage for the formal establishment of Freemasonry as this kind of, well, independent fraternity.
And then, of course, we have the Enlightenment, a huge turning point, not just for Freemasonry, but for the whole world, really.
The encyclopedia dedicates a whole section to this period. The early 1700s, that's when things really took off. You get the formation of the first Grand Lodge in London in 1717. That's considered the real starting point for, organized Freemasonry on a large scale.
So it became more structured, more standardized.
Definitely. And it spread like wildfire among the educated classes, the professionals. It aligned perfectly with the whole Enlightenment ethos. And then you get Grand Lodges popping up in Ireland, in Scotland. It became a real movement.
And the encyclopedia also talks about those constitutions from 1723 written by James Anderson.
Anderson's constitutions, yeah. That's a landmark document. It laid down the basic rules and principles for Freemasonry in this new era. And some of those ideas, they were pretty revolutionary for the time.
In what way?
Well, think about religious tolerance. Back then, that wasn't exactly common. But Anderson's constitutions, they basically said that a Mason, he just had to believe in God in a kind of general sense.
But not necessarily adhere to any specific religion or denomination.
Exactly. You could be Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. Didn't matter. As long as you believed in some higher power, you were good. And that was a huge deal, a real hallmark of Enlightenment thinking.
So it created this space where people from different religious backgrounds could come together.
That was the idea, yeah. And you also see a lot of intellectuals, scientists, even some political reformers. They all started joining the ranks. Voltaire was a Freemason, and there's even speculation about Isaac Newton.
Wow. It really was attracting some of the leading thinkers of the time.
It was. And of course, it became popular among the aristocracy, the gentry as well. You had nobles taking on leadership roles in the Grand Lodges, all these social connections forming.
It was almost fashionable to be a Freemason.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And those lodges, they really became centers of intellectual and social life. You'd have lectures on science, on philosophy. It was this whole network of people who were, interested in knowledge and self-improvement. And that emphasis on liberty, on equality, they were Masonic values that really resonated with the spirit of the Enlightenment.
And of course, this wasn't just happening in Britain. Freemasonry was spreading its wings across Europe.
Absolutely. France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy. It went everywhere. And the encyclopedia actually points out how different forms of Freemasonry started to emerge. Like in France, with the Grand Orient of France, which became much more politically active, much more, liberal in its approach. And you even had, kings and emperors involved. Frederick the Great of Prussia was a Freemason. Catherine the Great of Russia, she had a more complicated relationship with it.
So not everyone was a fan.
Not necessarily, but it
Hmm.
definitely spread throughout Europe, and those lodges, they became these hubs for discussing ideas, for debating, for kind of pushing those Enlightenment values forward. And there were even, internal debates within Freemasonry itself about, the right way to do things.
Like that split between the moderns and the ancients in England.
Right, that was a big one. The ancients felt the original Grand Lodge had, strayed from the true path, so to speak.
Yeah.
It was this whole debate about ritual, about administration, that finally ended up merging in 1813, forming the United Grand Lodge of England. But but that whole process really shows how important those traditions and that sense of regularity were to the Freemasons.
And then, of course, you have those massive political upheavals, the American Revolution, the French Revolution.
It was a tumultuous time, for
Yeah.
sure. And Freemasons, they were right in the thick of it. In the American colonies, lodges were super popular. So many of the founding fathers were Masons. Washington, Franklin,
Well, the
Revere.
list goes on and on.
It does. And those connections, they must have played a role in forging that sense of unity and trust among those leaders.
Right. And we even see potential Masonic influence on some of those early American symbols. The Encyclopedia mentions the Great Seal with the Eye of Providence and all that.
Right. And even though those symbols weren't, specifically Masonic, they definitely resonated with those Enlightenment ideas that many Masons embraced.
And what about actual Masonic symbols in like currency or architecture?
There's some of that too, though the encyclopedia stresses that it was more informal. Individual artists or architects who were Masons, they might have incorporated certain symbols, but it wasn't like an official policy or anything.
And it's interesting that Freemasonry as an organization remained officially neutral during the revolution.
Right. Lodges kept meeting, and there are even stories of, Masons on opposite sides of the conflict still treating each other with that brotherly respect.
So even in war, that bond could still hold strong.
It could. And then after independence, you see American Freemasonry really booming. State Grand Lodges forming, guys like Washington continuing to be active members. It really flourished in that new nation.
So, it might not have been the sole driving force, but the influence of Freemasonry, both through the individuals involved and through those core ideas of liberty and equality, it seems pretty undeniable.
The encyclopedia definitely presents a compelling case for that. And, the fact that the U.S. itself was founded on many of those same principles that Freemasons embraced,
Mm-hmm.
well, it created a very fertile ground for it to thrive.
Okay, now let's zoom out again and look at Freemasonry around the world. How did it fare in different cultural contexts?
Well, as it spread from those, British and European origins, it definitely took on different forms and faced different challenges depending on where it landed. In Britain, that union of the Grand Lodges in 1813, that brought a period of real stability, and the English regular style of Freemasonry that was exported all over the British Empire, though, of course, it wasn't always inclusive of the indigenous populations in those colonies.
And in Europe, things developed differently.
They did. In France, for example, you had the Grand Orient of France. They became much more politically active, much more liberal, and that eventually led to, well, to a formal split with the English Grand Lodges over the requirement for a belief in God, no less.
Ah, that's right. That was a major point of contention.
It was. And you see different branches of Freemasonry popping up with different priorities, different rules. It's not a monolithic entity by any means.
So Australia and New Zealand, for instance, what happened there?
Well, Freemasonry arrived with the colonists, as you might expect. By the late 1800s, they had their own autonomous Grand Lodges, and it became a pretty big deal in those societies. Africa, of course, that's a whole other story. It was brought over through colonization, and you see, segregated lodges in South Africa during apartheid. You see it being banned in some countries, embraced in others.
A real mixed bag.
It is. And then Asia and the Middle East, those are fascinating cases too. In places like Hong Kong and Singapore, it came through those colonial footholds. The Philippines is interesting because they got it from the Spanish, and it actually became tied to their nationalist movement.
Really? That's unexpected.
Yeah. And then you have Japan, Taiwan. They have established Grand Lodges now. But in the Middle East, it's much more complicated. There's been a lot of hostility towards Freemasonry, often linked to political instability and opposition from certain religious groups. Israel is a notable exception, though. They have a very active and relatively uncontroversial Masonic scene.
Interesting. So many different paths, so many different outcomes. And what about Latin America?
Latin America, that's a huge story. Freemasonry played a really crucial role in their independence movement. Simon Bolivar, Jose de San Martin, those guys were both Masons. And after those countries gained independence, Freemasonry, it thrived among those elite circles, often linked to liberal and anti-clerical viewpoints.
So it was really tied up in those political developments.
It was. And
Hmm.
even today, Freemasonry in Latin America, it's still a force to be reckoned with.
Wow. So it seems Freemasonry, even with its, ancient roots and its traditions, it's still evolving, still adapting to the modern world.
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia touches on some of those modern developments.
Yeah.
The continued growth of those appendant bodies, those specialized groups, the way it's adapted to different cultural norms, the challenges it's faced from totalitarian regimes, and even the way it's embracing technology.
Right. Online communication, virtual meetings, things are changing.
Things are changing, yeah. And of course, there's that whole question of women's involvement, which is still evolving.
Still a work in progress, it seems.
You could say that. But overall, Freemasonry today, it's a global phenomenon with this incredible mix of ancient tradition and modern adaptation.
Okay, well, now that we've explored the history and the organizational structure, let's talk about the really distinctive stuff.
You mean the rituals and the symbols?
That's what I'm talking about. That's what everyone's curious about.
Rightly so. It's
Yeah.
fascinating stuff. And the encyclopedia really emphasizes how central those symbols and rituals are to how Freemasonry teaches its lessons and preserves its traditions. It's a whole visual language almost.
So let's break it down, starting with, well, those iconic symbols. The square and compasses, that's the most recognizable one.
That's
Rome.
the big one, yeah. The square, it represents morality, virtue, honesty, justice, all those core values. And it also represents like our earthly existence, the need for right conduct.
And the
The
compasses.
compasses symbolize self-restraint, keeping your passions in check, setting those boundaries for your desires. So together they represent this balance between, our duties to others and our own inner moral compass. And then, of course, you have the G in the middle.
The G.
That usually stands for God, the
Yeah.
great architect of the universe. But it can also stand for geometry, which is seen as this kind of foundational science. So it's this really multi-layered symbol with a lot of depth to it.
Okay, what about the level and the plumb? Those are often mentioned as well.
Those are key symbols, too. The level represents equality, equality among all the members within the lodge and, more broadly, the equality of all mankind.
Makes sense, keeping everyone on the level.
Exactly. And the plumb, that's about uprightness, about living in accordance with your conscience.
Integrity, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Okay, and then we have the trowel and those ashlars, rough and perfect.
Right. The trowel, that symbolizes spreading brotherly love, unity, that kind of thing. And the ashlars, they represent man in his imperfect state, striving towards perfection through Masonic teachings.
So the rough ashlar is like the starting point,
Right.
and the perfect ashlar is the ideal.
That's the goal, yeah.
And what about those two pillars, the columns that you often see in those Masonic illustrations?
Ah, yes. Those are often called Boaz and Yachin, and they symbolize strength, stability, both physical and spiritual. Candidates in the initiation rituals, they often have to, symbolically pass between those pillars or approach them in some way.
So they're kind of like these symbolic gateways.
You could see it that way, yeah.
And there are all these other symbols too, the anchor and arc, the beehive.
Oh, yes, so many symbols. The encyclopedia goes into detail about all of them. The anchor and arc represent